How many SEC teams can qualify for the inaugural 12-team college football playoff? That will be one of the top storylines to monitor throughout this 2024 season. Welcome into SEC Football Unfiltered, our podcast from the USA Today Network. I'm Blake Toppmeyer, and I'm back alongside John Adams. John is back from vacation. John told me there'd be no better way to welcome him back to the podcast than if you were to hit that subscribe button or give us a rating or review. Those ratings and reviews help us find new listeners. Today on the pod, we're going to offer our 4 sneaky good non-conference games involving an SEC team this season. These are games that we don't feel like rise to the level of a Texas versus Michigan, but they're high-impact games nonetheless that have our attention. But first, a look at the expanded 12-team playoff. John, let's start here. I think as we look at this playoff, the interesting debate as it pertains to the SEC is how many are they going to get in? I mean, like in the 4-team playoff, we knew they were going to get minimum of 1, maximum of 2 teams in the 4-team playoff. That changes with a 12-teamer. As I look at it, and I've written about this in some columns, I see like 4 or 5 sort of being the number for the SEC. It's possible, they could get fewer than 4, but I don't think it's likely. And theoretically, it's possible they could get more than 5, but I think that would be quite the stretch. How do you see this? Are you sort of on the higher or lower end, or do you kind of come in at that 4 or 5 area?
No, I agree with you. I think the SEC gets 4 teams in, and I think there could be a mad scramble for that 5th spot. That's why I view non-conference games this year as, in some ways, just as important as SEC games, because it's not as though you're setting out to make the SEC championship game now. If you're a highly rated team and optimistic about the season, you're thinking, how do you get in the playoff? That's going to determine success or failure in this brave new world of college football, making the playoff or not making the playoffs. So I think it's interesting the way the schedule is set up this year. We're getting out of divisional play, but there are enough of these good teams. It seems as though the teams it might not be at the very top end. The schedule is accommodating, so that can enhance their chances. So I think it's going to be a really interesting season because of that. But I think 4 definitely, and then that 5th team. I mean, there might be 3 or even 4 teams competing for that last spot.
Yeah, and we're going to wind up with obviously a lot of disappointed fan bases because I
Yeah.
think as we come into this, there's probably like 9 or 10 teams whose fan bases will come into the season thinking, hey, we got a shot to make the playoffs this year. And it's not unreasonable to think that. I mean, I can think of, there's probably about 9 teams that I would say will be preseason top 25 from the SEC, and that makes you a legitimate preseason playoff hopeful, I think. But, if you have 9 teams that think they're in contention, half of those teams are going to be left out in the cold. The SEC is in an interesting place because I think there's really only one other conference that can seriously threaten to put 4 or 5 teams in the playoff, and that's obviously the Big Ten. I mean, we've talked about it before, the Super 2 conferences that have emerged in college football. I mean, 5 leagues are going to get a team. We know that the Power 4 will get automatic qualifiers with their conference champions, and then the best group of 5 conference champion is in as well. And then the scramble is on for those 7 at-large bids. But it's going to be a lot of SEC and Big Ten teams gobbling up those at-larges. So I wonder, as we look at the behemoth 18-team Big Ten that now has Oregon, Washington, Southern Cal, and UCLA, and we look at the expanded 16-team SEC, 4 or 5, again, appears to be the number. I'm wondering if you think which is more likely, that the SEC qualifies 5 or that the Big Ten qualifies 5. And I'm not saying either is going to happen, but if one of those 2 conferences were to get 5, which way do you lean?
Oh, I would lead heavily toward the SEC, and not just because this is SEC football unfiltered. and not Big
That
10.
has nothing
But
to do with it, right, John?
not at all. No, we're not that provincial here. I look at the Big 10 and I have more questions about teams in that league. Just the whole idea of this coast to coast scheduling and long road trips, how will that impact things? I don't know how the Pac 12 will adjust. Will it really strengthen the Big Ten that much initially? I'm not sure. I think Washington won't be as good as last year. I think Oregon could be. But when I look at the Big Ten, and if Jim Harbaugh would have stayed at Michigan, I would have said Michigan's a sure thing. I don't think Michigan is a sure thing right now. I think Ohio State is. I mean, if I were going to bet on any team making the playoff, I would probably pick Ohio State based on depth chart and schedule.
Mm-hmm.
But beyond that, and I really like Oregon and Dan Lanning, but beyond that, I'm just not so sure. Penn State, if we look at Penn State's recent history, it's not good enough to beat out Ohio State and Michigan. It's well established. It plays those teams with a little hope, but it's certainly got an opportunity to go 10-2. And if it can point to those games and say, well, we lost to these incredibly talented traditional powerhouses, maybe that could help Penn State. But I'm just as not as sure of the Big Ten right
Yeah,
now.
yeah. James Franklin has become sort of the Big Ten's version of Lane Kiffin. Of like you can pencil him in for about 10 wins. He's not going to beat the Big Ten's version of Alabama and Georgia, but he's going to beat all the other teams that you think he can beat. And lo and behold, they finished with 10 wins. That wasn't good enough to make a 4-team playoff. But I agree with you. I think the conversation with the Big Ten starts with those three, some ordering of Ohio State and Oregon, and then Penn State. And one advantage Penn State has this year, Michigan's not on the schedule. So they're probably still going to lose to Ohio State, but I think they get some scheduling breaks that fall their way. And so I really like those three from the Big Ten to be in the field. But where I lean, like you do, SEC has a better chance of qualifying five is I mentioned, I think there's going to be 9 contenders from the SEC. And let's just run through them. That's Georgia, Texas, Alabama, no particular order here, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Missouri, Ole Miss, LSU, and Texas A&M. That's where I draw the line. I think those 9 come into the season as playoff hopefuls. In the Big Ten, I see 5. I see the 3 that we've been talking about, Ohio State, Oregon, Penn State. I think those 3 are going to get in. And then you have Michigan and Southern Cal that I think will be in contention. Southern Cal has a brutal schedule, though. Non-conference, they play LSU and Notre Dame. Inside the conference, they have Michigan, Penn State, Wisconsin, Washington. That's 6 toss-up games right there. They go 50-50 in those. They're 9-3. They're out of the playoff. Michigan, they got a pretty tough schedule too. Texas, USC, Washington, at Oregon, Ohio State. You can see real quickly there, Texas, Oregon, Ohio State stand out. That's 3 potential losses. 9-3, they're not getting in. So I think there's a better chance that the Big Ten winds up with just 3 than they get 5. And I struggle to come up with more than 5, realistic contenders for the Big Ten once it gets past, the big 3, as we're calling them, Oregon, Ohio State, Penn State. Then you add in Michigan and Southern Cal. That's sort of where I draw the line with the Big Ten.
I really like Oregon because of its coach. I like what Dan Lanning has done there, and also because of its quarterback. I think we've talked about this before, but I think Oklahoma transfer Dylan Gabriel is a strong Heisman contender with that schedule, with the talent around him, and with that Oregon offensive system. I just think he can put up huge numbers, and we've seen him play really well in big games. He did that against Oklahoma, against Texas last year for Oklahoma. See, I'm really, I really think Southern Cal always has enough talent to be a top 10 team. You can't prove that by its 1-loss record, but it puts out all these good players, and for some reason, it just I don't know, it just kind of stumbles around at times in games you think it should win and it doesn't.
Sounds a
Uh,
little Texas A&M-ish, doesn't it? Every year we talk a ton about A&M in the
yeah,
preseason, and the
you're
season
right.
rolls around. Yeah,
Except Southern Cal has a little bit more of a storied history
true.
when you
Yeah,
go back.
very true.
It's Heisman list and national championships. Um, I don't think I just don't know if Southern Cal can manage that schedule. And from what I've read, it's trying desperately or tried desperately to get out of that LSU game in Las Vegas. And LSU says, we're playing that game. You're not, it's not like you're trying to buy BYU out of a game. LSU doesn't need the money right now. So I just, I don't think there will be more than three Big Ten teams uh, in the playoff. I really don't.
Well, if
I
there is only three, I really think that blows the door open for the SEC to get five. If there's four from the Big Ten, there's still an avenue for the SEC to get five, but they have to have everything fall their way. If the Big Ten gets four, the ACC can only get one. It has to be, let's say, either Florida State or Clemson. I'm not sure how many contenders the ACC has beyond those two. For the SEC to get five, the ACC would only have to get one. The Big 12 would only be able to get one. And then the other fly in the ointment here is Notre Dame. Notre Dame can be the party crashers as far as the SEC's concerned, because if Notre Dame gets one of those at-larges, if the Big Ten's getting four, you can kiss the idea of the SEC getting five goodbye, because that other bid is going to swing Notre Dame's way. So Notre Dame is going to have a lot of influence on this SEC season, and that starts in week one when they're playing an SEC team in Texas A&M. That would be a huge win, not only for the Aggies, but for the entire conference. I mean, if A&M beats Notre Dame in week one, then if it comes down to a debate, who's getting the final spot, the fifth best SEC team or a Notre Dame team that has a loss to A&M, I think then you could see it tipping in the SEC's favor. So, what do you see as being maybe the top threat to the SEC getting five? Do you think it's A, Notre Dame crashing the playoff and grabbing a bid, B, the Big Ten grabbing 4 or 5 bids? You've already said you kind of lean 3 with the Big Ten. Or C, am I overlooking the fact that the Big 12 or ACC could get 2 bids apiece? Because if those conferences become 2-bid leagues, I think that shuts down the avenue for the SEC to get 5. Which of those do you think the SEC ought to be maybe most concerned about limiting their playoff spots?
Well, see, since I'm already on record as saying I don't think the Big Ten will get more than three. Um, I also think A&M is going to beat Notre Dame.
Okay. All right.
So I think if I were SEC and I'm lobbying and competing for a playoff spot, I would be concerned about the Big 12. I just I I just am not sure. I think there are possibilities for Big 12 teams to kind of come out of nowhere uh and have a great season. Um and I can't pinpoint a team that could do that. I just think there are possibilities there. When I look at the ACC, I don't really see that. You've mentioned it already, and I think that's how most people look at the ACC.
It's a
It's
two-team league. Yeah.
as Clemson and Florida State, and I'm not sold on Clemson. I'm not even sold on Florida State. Uh, but I think definitely those teams have a chance to run the rest of the ACC table. But I'm not sure they're good enough to do that. I don't know. Do you have an idea if you had to pick a third team from the ACC as a
Boy.
threat to within the league or outside the league competing for a berth? Can you come up with a third team?
It gets pretty tough. I mean, I think it's I think it's more likely the ACC gets one than they would get three. Much more likely, and maybe it stretches to two, but I would have to think that's Florida State and Clemson at that point. I mean, I'd say the third best team from the ACC is probably SMU, which you might be having whiplash there, like what SMU in the ACC, but they're one of the newcomers into the conference this year. But I mean, that's sort of an indictment on the conference when you can be the newcomer, from a Group of Five league, and all of a sudden you might be the third best team in your new conference. But I think that probably is the reality. I think SMU will open as a top 25 team, and may well be the third best team in the ACC. But you hit on something I think that could be lurking in the shadows that I think maybe I'm not giving enough credence to is what if the Big 12 snags two? Now, the Big 12 might be the fourth best Power Four league overall, third or fourth, but I think they do have three teams where the ACC might lack that third contender. In the Big 12, I think Oklahoma State's going to be pretty good. And then you have Kansas State and Utah that I think also will open the season in the top 20. So you have three potential top 20 teams there. What if you have two of them that navigate the season with one loss? You could have a rematch in the Big 12 championship game and the result flips. That's another potential scenario the SEC does not want. That they don't want the flip of a regular season game, turning on its head and in the Big 12 championship game. Whoever is your Big 12 regular season champion, if you're in the SEC, you want that team to go ahead and win the conference championship too, and shut down the door on the Big 12 getting two bids.
I'm still trying to grasp the idea of SMU being a dark horse candidate.
I knew that one was going to derail
playoff
you, John.
outside the ACC. I mean, I flashed back to the early 1980s when they were, were giving out the keys to Trans Ams to elite recruits and making waves as if they might win the national championship outright. So I that's really interesting. I have an affinity for Texas teams, so I never rule out. I mean, look what happened a couple of years ago with TCU crashing the playoff party. I mean, I always wonder about those Texas teams, and still TCU is gone down, but I really think there's an opportunity for teams. A team like Utah, I think, is really an interesting team. It acquitted itself well in the Pac-12 in the final days of the Pac-12. Last season was misleading because it lost its quarterback, and Cam Rising never played. Had he played, that season might have been completely different for the Utes and for the entire Pac-12. So I just think it's really interesting, and I think if I had to, who would you pick? Let's forget the Big Ten for a second.
Consider them forgotten.
Okay. And we're looking as competition for the SEC. Do you favor Notre Dame? Do you favor a second team from the ACC or a second team from the Big 12? I guess what I'm asking you to do is really how much credence do you give Notre Dame football right now?
I think so much of it depends on that week one game. I mean, if we're looking at non-conference games of weight in the SEC, and I know we're going here in a minute, so let's just go there now. I think Texas against Michigan gets so much of the preseason attention, rightfully so. Those are two teams that were in the college football playoff last year. Michigan defending national champion, Texas in a new conference. I mean, that is going to be the game in week 2 of the season, and there's really not a close second. I mean, that is taking all the spotlight in week 2. But as we think about other games that carry significant weight, I think that Texas A&M hosting Notre Dame in week 1 is huge. And it's not just big for those two programs, because if A&M wins, yeah, I mean, that's a statement in week 1. And maybe we're thinking a little bit more seriously about the Aggies as playoff contenders. But it goes beyond that. I mean, that is a haymaker for Notre Dame in week 1, because they play a pretty cupcake schedule this year. Notre Dame's schedule sort of comes and goes. Some years it's awfully tough, other years it's a bit of a joke. And this year it tends to be more of a joke. And I don't think they're safe at 10-2 because their schedule's so soft this year. If they were to fall to 10-2, I think they're on the bubble. And so if you lose to an SEC team, A&M in week 1, it leaves you no margin for error. They do have Southern Cal later in the season. They have Louisville on the schedule. They have Florida State on the schedule. I said the schedule's pretty soft. It is beyond those 4 games. But if you lose in week 1, you have no margin for error and 3 toughies left because like I said, I don't think they're safe at 10-2. So I'm not really trying to avoid your question, but ask me again in week 2 because I think that determines the fate of Notre Dame. If they beat A&M in week 1, they've got an inside track to make the playoff because I think their schedule's pretty forgiving from there. If they lose to A&M, I think they're in trouble.
If you're pointing toward Louisville as a challenging opponent and as a possible marquee win, you're already in trouble. Consider this scenario. Notre Dame loses to Texas A&M in the opener, and LSU thumps Southern Cal. Then go a little further down that road and say Southern Cal doesn't fare well in the Big Ten, doesn't fare as well as expected. So what can Notre Dame point to? It needs Southern Cal to be good, and it needs to beat A&M. But see, you're teasing me to go down a well-worn path here. You are, as you speak, you're raising expectations for Texas A&M. I mean, it happens. I do it every year. My expectations for the Aggies high going into the season. They betray my expectations.
Tale
Lose
as old
games
as
they're
time.
supposed to. Yeah, lose games they're supposed to win, and then I get ready for the next season. I look about. Yeah, they didn't play up to snuff last season. That's in keeping with their recent history, but I don't want to cement that history. I want to be able to look at it and say, well, but this could be the year where that changes. The fact is, and why that happens, the fact is Texas A&M recruits good players. It really does, and it's had some troublesome injuries. Last season, its quarterback, when we thought Connor Wigman might be taking a step up the ladder as a quarterback, he goes down. So here we go again, and I'm thinking, look at it not just from a Notre Dame perspective, look at it from an Aggies perspective. What if Texas A&M beats Notre Dame? You can forget Notre Dame. What does that do for Texas A&M? A new coach, optimism soars in Aggie land. That's why what makes this some of these early games so intriguing.
Yeah, well, let's go further down that road, John, since we're on the topic of non-conference games, because you and I have teamed up to highlight 4 what we're calling sneaky good non-conference matchups. And again, it's worth noting, games not considered for this conversation is Texas, Michigan. We know that's a good non-conference matchup. And even Georgia against Clemson, let's say in week 1. Georgia's a pretty significant betting favorite in that game, but you have Georgia against one of the ACC's front runners in week 1. We know that's an important non-conference matchup. So we're looking a little bit more on that second tier of non-conference games. You got 2 picked out, and so do I. So fire away with your first sneaky good non-conference game involving an SEC team.
This is really sneaky here.
Oh boy.
Missouri is regarded as a playoff contender.
Mm-hmm.
That alone makes headlines. I know it's coming off an 11-2 season, which a lot of people, myself included, didn't see coming. And it lost a great player in Cody Schrader. But you look at that schedule and the quarterback wide receiver combo coming back. You just think Missouri could sneak in there. So Missouri's pretty sneaky right there. It's got a really favorable SEC schedule. So it is one of my sneaky good picks. I'll for a non-conference game, it would be Boston College versus Missouri. Even though I'm convinced that Missouri, I give it all the credit in the world for being much better than I thought last season. And now I've kind of switched sides and I'm saying Eli Drinkwitz might know what he's doing. I wasn't sure of that before last season. Now I'm thinking they could be pretty good. But how will Missouri handle success? And how will it step outside the league and playing kind of a no-name opponent? Boston College, yeah, it's in a Power 5 conference. And yeah, somebody named Flutie, I think, played there many
Yeah,
years
somebody. I
ago.
think I've
Kinda
heard of him.
yeah, he had one of those Hail Mary deals. I may be wrong, it was a long time ago, about 40 years, I think, but so it's not a high-profile team, but just through happenstance, I've seen BC play tough teams really well at times. Didn't always pull off an upset, but was competitive. I wonder how Missouri would handle that kind of situation. And also, Boston College has a new coach, Bill O'Brien. I mean, the guy knows football.
Hmm.
I mean, he coached Tom Brady. He's been a head coach. He can come up with a game plan. He can scheme. Uh, and that game, to me, that could be challenging for Boston College. Even on the surface, when you look at it, you say, "Oh, you're supposed to beat a mid-level ACC team if you're a playoff contender."
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned Boston College's track record. Like, I mean, they went 7-6 last year, and they
Yeah.
returned a reasonable amount of production. I mean, and they're not tops in the nation in terms of returning production, but when you look at the preseason analytical rankings for returning production, they hold up pretty well, and they played in a lot of close games last year. And I think you were touching on this that maybe they don't always beat the big boys, but they can hang with them. They had that September game last year. It was a week 3 game against Florida State, and they nearly beat Florida State. Uh, and they finished the season. I was talking about SMU. They finished the season beating SMU in a bowl game. So, SMU's so good. Well, Boston College beat them. So yeah, that one is a certainly flying below the radar, and it kind of reminds me a little bit of last year early in the season. Missouri, I mean, they had their backs against the wall against Kansas State in a non-conference game at Faurot Field, and the thicker kicker, Harrison Mevis, banged through about a 60 plus, no, it was a 61 yarder, I think, after
I was
your
thinking
man.
it was 63 yarded, but I mean, can they keep that guy around? Can they get a COVID year or maybe 3 COVID years out of that kicker?
Yeah, they need to give him a lifetime contract, and yeah, retain him. So, okay, so we got your number one. It is sneaky good. I would have to say. I was not necessarily expecting you to go there with your first one. I'll give you a week 2 game. I mentioned that the week 2 schedule is a little bit lacking behind Texas, Michigan. But how about Tennessee against North Carolina State in Charlotte? North Carolina State under Dave Doran has been a pretty consistent program the last several years. They're not going to win the ACC title, but you can pencil them in for about 8-9 wins. Seems like Tennessee has what I would call a manageable schedule to get to the playoffs. They have marquee games against Georgia, Alabama, on the road at Oklahoma. Those are kind of the biggest 3. Win even one out of those 3, and they're a playoff contender. But they have to take care of business against everybody else. And we know in the last 2 seasons, Tennessee has gotten trounced in a game that maybe going into the season we weren't expecting that in. 2 years ago, when they had that storied season with Hendon Hooker, in November they go on the road, get whipped by South Carolina. Last year they go on the road, get destroyed by Missouri. And so this NC State game to me is sort of a swing game that will tell us really quickly, is Tennessee a contender or a pretender for the playoff? You lose to NC State, with those three teams I was talking about still on the schedule to come, in Oklahoma, Alabama, and Georgia, forget about it. You lose to NC State, you're not going to the playoff. You beat NC State, I think then the hype starts to build. And NC State got transfer quarterback Grayson McCall, a name that should be pretty familiar to college football fans. He played about 27 seasons at Coastal Carolina, it seemed like, made Coastal Carolina consistently one of the better group of five programs in the country. Well, he's back for his victory lap, but it's at NC State. That's a guy that Auburn was looking at for a while to be a transfer quarterback for them. Now, it didn't work out with McCall transferring to Auburn, but he's a guy that I think is probably good enough to contend for an SEC quarterback job. Winds up at NC State. We know what Tennessee has in their ballyhood quarterback in Nico, but that to me is one that will identify for us real quickly. Whether an SEC team is really a true contender for the playoff, much like that A&M game we were talking about in week 1 against Notre Dame will start to tell us in very, very early whether they're a contender or pretender. I think this week 2 game for Tennessee will as well.
Yeah, Blake, when I look at Tennessee's schedule, you mentioned Oklahoma, Alabama, and Georgia. I see Georgia as Tennessee's certainly an underdog, and I see those other 2 games, Alabama at Neyland Stadium and Oklahoma in Norman, as swing games. But I think the 4th toughest game on Tennessee's schedule is NC State. It's hard for me to give mid-level, and I still think of NC State as mid-level because I get in the ACC. I guess it's because of what we said earlier. We think Clemson and Florida State have the potential to be very good now in a given year. But then everybody else just kind of, I don't know, just kind of mingle together, and it's hard to distinguish somebody. Dave Dorn has had success there. He's a defensive-minded coach. I think what makes this game more troublesome for Tennessee is that quarterback. Now, he's going up a notch in a level of competition too. However, Tennessee has been vulnerable in the secondary. Ever since Josh Heupel, that's been the Achilles heel. Ever since Josh Heupel got there, this is his 4th team. Secondary has never been anywhere near a strength. And you look what's happened against good quarterbacks, even in some wins. I mean, you go back to 2022, Anthony Richardson of Florida, he made some NFL money that game by the way he played against Tennessee. Bryce Young did about as much as any quarterback could do in a loss. So Tennessee is vulnerable in that area. And I don't know if McCall is that good of a quarterback because of the competition he's been playing, but you can't rule out that he's really, really good. And
it is hard to tell. I mean,
yeah.
He hasn't had many marquee games throughout his 5 seasons playing in the Sun Belt. Yes, 5 seasons. This is one of those 6th-year quarterbacks still lingering around using their COVID year to play a 6th season. So, I mean, he's put up some big numbers throughout the course of his career. You're right. At Coastal Carolina, he wasn't playing teams like Tennessee, but I think you touched on something important there. Tennessee's got an entirely new look secondary. That position's been a weakness for them, as you said, last couple years and some of their losses. I think there's the hope that with new faces come improvement, but it's also possible that they've just sort of rearranged the deck chairs, so to speak, and that it won't necessarily result in an improvement. And I think week 2 could be an indicator of that. All right, let's get to your other sneaky good non-conference game.
This game is sneaky good, but it really has absolutely no playoff implications.
Okay, I'm waiting with bated breath now.
This is, but it does have SEC ramifications because it's Florida versus Miami. And Florida is a program that's supposed to be good. It did play in a SEC championship game under Dan Mullen a few years ago. He's been fired, making way for Billy Napier, who has done absolutely nothing to convince anybody that he can be successful at Florida. Back-to-back 7 lost seasons. The hot seat is scorching for him. And I look at Florida's schedule. I could at least see it losing 6 of its last 7 games. The schedule is brutal. So playing Miami, those first 5 games, including Miami, those are games that maybe Florida could win, and it really needs to win. So you go into Miami, and Miami is we thought it would get better under Mario Cristobal. I guess that was the consensus. But nobody's going to get past that game he threw away against Georgia Tech when he should have been trying to run out the clock and got way too creative. Fumble. Georgia Tech pulls off an upset. Uh, Miami's added some key transfers, including quarterback Cam Ward from Washington State. I watched him some in the Pac-12, where you have a lot of good quarterbacks, or you did. So Miami could be sneaky good. Maybe it's the third team in the ACC that we've been trying to find. So
Yeah,
that will
I
go
was
ahead.
thinking about that, John, as you said. Well, this game doesn't have playoff implications, and I know you mean from an SEC lens because we don't see
Yes.
Florida as a playoff contender. But as you were talking there, I thought Miami might be that third best team from the ACC we were looking for. And as you hit on it, they added the star transfer quarterback Cam Ward, and Miami's schedule pretty favorable there in that they don't have to play Clemson during the regular season. The only way they would see Clemson is in a potential ACC championship game. Now they do play Florida State, but if they beat Florida, they beat Louisville, they avoid Clemson. Even with the loss to Florida State, you could be going into an ACC championship game sitting at 11-1. So that could be the other team from the ACC we were looking for. And from strictly an SEC lens, I agree with you. Huge game for Billy Napier. Put the playoff aside for a moment, and this is a guy that's 11-14 after 2 seasons. I don't care what his AD says. Scott Strickland, his AD, has insisted, Billy Napier's not on the hot seat. Well,
Ha, ha.
we can say whatever
We'll
we
tell
want.
the jokes. Come on.
Yeah,
Not
that's
on the
right.
hot seat.
We'll
Yeah.
tell the jokes here.
Like he can go lose 7 games in 3 consecutive years and keep his job at Florida. Does Scott Strickland, has he forgotten where he is? He's at Florida. He's not at Mississippi State.
Right, and he's already fired Dan Mullen, so I'm not sure Scott Strickland is the authority on Billy Napier's job security at the moment, particularly if Billy Napier were to lose at home in Week 1 against a non-conference rival in Miami. I like that one, John. I think that I would probably have that a little higher on my sneaky good list than Missouri against Boston College. I think Missouri's going to handle Boston College, but I see why you went there because of Missouri's playoff potential. I understand that one, but I really think that Miami Florida one is going to be very telling for each of those teams, and I'm going to piggyback off that for my final sneaky good non-conference game because we're staying in Florida. Florida's schedule so loaded this year. They're playing 11 Power Four opponents, including a couple in-state, well, 3 in-state non-conference teams, and the one I have highlighted is UCF comes to town to play Florida. I mean, wouldn't that one be just crippling for Billy Napier? That's one of those games where even though UCF, might be a pretty solid team this year, they'll probably be a middle of the pack Big 12 team. They got my man at quarterback, KJ Jefferson, whom I championed. I was the president of the KJ Jefferson fan club, it seemed like, at Arkansas the last few years. And boy, Arkansas really let me down last season. But hey, KJ's left that behind him. He's moved on. He's at UCF now with the Gus Bus, Malzahn, and they're going to the Swamp in Week 5, October 5th. And I'm just thinking, what if Florida loses to Miami in Week 1? They're not going to make a coaching change in Week 1, embattled though Billy Napier may be. But you lose to Miami in Week 1, and then you lose to UCF at the Swamp in Week 5. Katie bar the door and cut the check. I mean, that might be all she wrote. Now, I don't think that'll happen. I actually think Florida is going to be better this year. I don't know that their record is going to show it because their schedule is so tough. I think they will win that game against UCF. Might beat Miami in week 1, but because of all the narratives there with, playing the team that was sort of the little guy punching above its weight for so many years, UCF. Now UCF in the Power Four conference. Billy Napier, he's got to get himself off the hot seat. A lot of good narratives, I think, and it's got my guy KJ Jefferson on UCF, so I can't overlook that.
You also can't overlook Gus Malzahn. I mean, who would you rather have for your coach on game day, Gus Malzahn or Billy Napier?
At this point, that's looking like an open and shut case.
Yeah, I don't think we have to give that a lot of thought. Gus Malzahn, he didn't work out in the end at Auburn, but he won a lot of big games there. I mean, he beat really good teams. He's also really good with running quarterbacks, with dual threat quarterbacks. And I'm not that familiar with UCF's personnel. I watched it a couple of times last season. But KJ Jefferson is a scary quarterback. I'm probably not been as high on him as you have, but he's a scary quarterback in that everything can go wrong on a play. And then you look up and he's just busted 5 tackles on the way to the end zone. I mean, he's got that Tim Tebow like turbo drive going where he can just run through tacklers. I think
I think this is going to be a good reboot for Jefferson too, because he was at his best at Arkansas when he was playing in the Kendall Briles spread offense, and then they went in a different direction offensively last year. Didn't suit KJ. Well, now he's going back into a system that I think will be much better for him, playing in Malzahn's spread. You mentioned Malzahn's history with quarterbacks who can run it. I mean, KJ Jefferson's not the same type of runner that Cam Newton was and is, not the same type of talent, but he is, to your point, a very bruising, a powerful, punishing, running quarterback who can throw it downfield too. It's sort of that in-between stuff that maybe gives Jefferson more problems. He can chuck it deep or he could run you over. And I think he'll like playing for Gus Malzahn better than he fared last year in that offense at Arkansas. And I don't know if it gets him back to the Kendall Briles days of success, but I think it's going to be better than he was last year.
Yeah, I think, and you go back to Malzahn, he's an offensive coordinator at Auburn when it had Cam Newton, and you think about what he's done with quarterbacks. I also think of Malzahn as kind of a big play guy. Maybe it's a trick play or he'll run plays that set something up big, seemingly mundane plays that lead to something much bigger. So I just think that's going to be another tough game for Florida. And here's a big issue with Florida. I mean, we talked about the Miami game. We've talked about the UCF game. Those are probably a couple of the least consequential opponents Florida will play all season. Yeah, I think Florida might be better than it was last year, but how much better? And it might have more depth, but it doesn't have enough depth. You know how it goes. When you're playing tough games week after week, there's just a wearing down emotionally, mentally, not just physically. Florida can't mail it in but a couple of weeks all season when it's playing a game. I guess that's why I guess I might as well say Billy Napier's doomed. I don't know how much clearer I can make it.
I think you've already cut the buyout check. And in your mind, John,
yeah.
the check's already written. It's not your money.
Yeah, I'm thinking of who's next.
All right, no wearing down here on the podcast. Plenty more to discuss in the weeks to come as it pertains to the 12-team playoff, as it pertains to the non-conference schedule. And John and I will be with you throughout the offseason. Thanks for listening to this edition of SEC Football Unfiltered.